It was a bright and peaceful Tuesday morning. The sun was shining softly through the thin curtains of Sarah's small house. Birds were chirping outside, and the smell of freshly made tea filled the air. Sarah stood in front of the mirror, tying her hair neatly into a bun. She looked simple, dressed in a clean but faded dress and a small pair of sandals that had seen better days. She smiled faintly to herself. Today she was going to the bank to deposit her savings, money she had earned from months of hard work. Sarah wasn't rich, but she was proud of the life she had built. She ran a small home-based business, sewing clothes for neighbors and repairing torn garments. Every coin she earned carried a story of effort and patience. She didn't care about luxury or fame. All she wanted was security for her little family and peace in her heart. Her husband, David, was away most of the time because of his work. To anyone who saw Sarah, she looked like a regular woman from an ordinary neighborhood. No one would guess that her husband was one of the most successful businessmen in the city, a quiet billionaire who preferred a humble life. Sarah never bragged about him. She believed that wealth was not something to show off, but something to handle with grace. After finishing her tea, she carefully counted the money she had saved, the exact amount she wanted to deposit in her bank account. She placed the bills inside an old brown envelope, folded it neatly, and put it in her worn-out handbag. Her heart felt light, almost joyful. It wasn't a big amount, but it represented her effort, her long nights, and her pride in being independent. Before leaving, she took one last look around the small but cozy house. The curtains fluttered as a cool breeze entered. She smiled, feeling thankful for the simple things she had. Locking the door behind her, she stepped out into the morning sun. The streets were already busy. Children rushing to school, shopkeepers lifting shutters, and vendors calling out their prices. Sarah walked quietly along the road, holding her bag close. She was used to walking rather than taking a cab. It gave her time to think. As she walked, she passed by a group of well-dressed women standing near a cafe talking loudly about shopping and vacations. For a moment, Sarah felt a small sting in her heart. She didn't envy them, but she often wondered how different her life was from theirs. Still, she reminded herself of something she always believed. A kind heart is richer than a full purse. That thought made her smile again. When she reached the bus stop, an elderly man greeted her. "Good morning, Sarah," he said warmly. "Off to the bank today?" "Yes, Mr. Lewis," she replied kindly. "It's deposit day." He nodded, smiling. Everyone in the neighborhood respected Sarah. She was known for her honesty and helpful nature. Even when she had little, she always found a way to share something with others, a meal, a smile, or kind words. The bus arrived, old and noisy, but familiar. Sarah climbed aboard and took a seat near the window. As the bus moved through the city, she watched the buildings pass by. Tall glass offices, bright advertisements, and people rushing in all directions. She often felt out of place in the busy world, but she didn't mind. She liked living slowly, noticing small details others ignored. The laughter of children, the smell of bakeries, the kindness in strangers' eyes. After a short ride, the bus stopped near the main street where the bank was located. Sarah stepped down carefully and adjusted her bag on her shoulder. The bank stood tall and modern with shining glass doors and a large logo at the entrance. It looked intimidating, but she reminded herself that she had every right to be there. It was her bank too. She took a deep breath and walked toward the building. Her sandals made soft sounds against the marble floor as she entered. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of perfume and paper. She could see people dressed in expensive clothes, holding smartphones and talking in confident tones. Sarah, in her plain dress and old handbag, felt a little out of place. Still, she kept her head high and joined the line. As she waited, she looked around. A young woman in front of her was scrolling through her phone, wearing a gold bracelet that sparkled under the light. Another man behind her was complaining loudly about his credit card limit. Sarah smiled faintly. She had no such worries. Her world was simpler. She believed in earning honestly, spending wisely, and living peacefully. Minutes passed. Sarah moved closer to the counter, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. She had been saving this money for months, and finally, it was time to keep it safe in the bank. She imagined how proud David would be if he saw her. Independent, strong, and quietly doing her part. Little did she know this ordinary morning was about to become unforgettable. What started as a simple visit to the bank would soon turn into a moment that would test her patience, challenge her pride, and reveal a truth that would leave everyone in shock. But for now, Sarah stood there unaware of what was coming. Just a modest woman, waiting with a calm heart and a hopeful smile, ready to deposit her hard-earned savings. When Sarah stepped into the bank, she felt the sudden change in atmosphere. Outside, the world was noisy and alive, and people laughing, cars honking, birds singing. But inside the bank, everything was cold, polished, and filled with quiet murmurs. The sound of clicking heels echoed on the marble floor. The air smelled of strong perfume mixed with the scent of new currency notes and fresh paper. She paused for a moment near the entrance, clutching her handbag tightly. A few people glanced at her, then turned away as if she didn't belong. Sarah wasn't dressed like most of them. Her dress was simple, her sandals a little old, and her bag was the kind that people usually replaced long ago. But she walked forward confidently. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here to do something honest. The line was already long. A dozen people stood waiting, shifting from one foot to the other, glancing impatiently at their phones. Sarah quietly joined the end of the queue. She smiled politely at the woman in front of her, but the woman only gave her a quick look and turned away. Sarah didn't mind. She was used to such reactions. People often judged her by her appearance. Minutes passed slowly. Sarah watched the staff behind the counters moving quickly between computer screens and papers. Most of them looked tired or uninterested. She noticed how they smiled warmly at customers who wore expensive clothes but acted distant toward others. As Sarah waited, she opened her handbag to check the envelope once more. The edges were a little crumpled, but the money inside was safe. She took out the deposit slip and began to fill it out carefully with her pen. Her handwriting was neat but slightly shaky, not because she was scared, but because she wanted everything to be perfect. Behind her, a man in a sharp black suit sighed loudly. "Can't they open another counter?" He grumbled. "Some of us have important meetings." Another woman responded with a laugh. "Maybe they should give special lines for people who actually have real money to deposit." Sarah heard them but stayed silent. She didn't like conflict. Instead, she quietly focused on writing the correct account number, pretending their words didn't matter. The line moved forward, one customer at a time. Sarah looked around to pass the time. A young mother was trying to calm her crying child. An elderly man was arguing with a clerk about missing documents. And near the corner, a group of employees whispered and giggled about something on their phones. Then it happened. The teller at the main counter, a woman with perfect makeup and a sharp tone, looked up and called, "Next." Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her heart was beating a little faster, but she smiled politely as she placed her envelope and deposit slip on the counter. "Yes?" the teller asked without looking up, her voice flat. "I'd like to deposit this amount into my account, please," Sarah said softly. The teller glanced at the envelope, then at Sarah's face. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Is this your account?" she asked in a tone that sounded more like suspicion than a question. "Yes, it is," Sarah replied politely. The teller sighed. "We'll see," she muttered, opening the envelope and counting the cash. As she did, she frowned. "That's a very small amount," she said loudly enough for the people nearby to hear. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. She didn't know what to say. It wasn't a large deposit, but it was hers, earned with hard work and honesty. The woman behind Sarah chuckled softly and whispered something to the man next to her. He smirked. Sarah tried to ignore them, but the teller continued. "You know, we usually prefer customers who make meaningful deposits. Small amounts like this could be handled at the machine, you know." Sarah swallowed hard. "I just wanted to make sure it's entered correctly," she said quietly. The teller gave a short laugh. "Don't worry, dear. We know how to handle basic deposits." Her tone was drenched in sarcasm. A few people in the queue looked on, curious and entertained. Sarah felt as though all eyes were on her, silently judging. She clutched her bag tightly, her fingers trembling slightly. After a moment, the teller pushed the slip toward her. "Sign here," she said impatiently. Sarah did as she was told. But before she could step away, the teller's colleague leaned in and whispered something to her. They both giggled quietly. Sarah knew they were talking about her, though she couldn't hear the words. She turned away, her heart heavy. She had done nothing wrong, yet she felt small, invisible in a place where respect seemed to be given only to those who looked rich. As she moved to the side, she glanced at the other counters. The bank manager, a tall man in a blue suit, was walking around, checking on the staff. He greeted wealthy-looking clients with smiles and handshakes. When his eyes landed on Sarah, his expression changed. He frowned slightly, as if her presence somehow disturbed the picture of success he wanted his bank to represent. The line grew behind her, but Sarah stood quietly, waiting for her receipt. She reminded herself to stay calm. She had faced harder things in life, yet deep down she couldn't shake the sting of humiliation. Finally, the teller handed her the receipt, barely meeting her eyes. "Done," she said curtly. Sarah took it with a polite thank you and turned to leave. But before she could take a step, the manager began walking toward her, his face tight with authority, and a look that promised more embarrassment to come. Sarah took a deep breath, clutching her bag once again. She didn't know that in just a few minutes, everything in that bank, every face, every whisper, every judgment, and was about to change forever. Sarah stood quietly by the counter, holding her small receipt with trembling hands. She wanted to leave as quickly as possible, but before she could take a step, the bank manager's sharp voice called out behind her. "Excuse me, madam," he said, walking briskly toward her. His shoes clicked loudly on the shiny floor, announcing his authority. Everyone in the queue turned to look. Sarah turned slowly, unsure of what she had done wrong. "Yes?" she asked softly. The manager gave her a quick up-and-down glance. His expression was one of annoyance mixed with superiority. "Can I ask what business you have here?" he said, folding his arms. Sarah blinked, confused. "I just made a deposit," she replied, showing him her receipt politely. He took the slip from her hand and looked at it as though it were something dirty. "A deposit?" he repeated with disbelief. "This small amount?" Sarah felt her heart drop. His tone was cold, filled with mockery. The people standing in line began whispering again, their eyes fixed on her. "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "It's my savings." The manager gave a short, dry laugh. "Savings? Madam, we have separate counters for such small deposits. You've held up the line unnecessarily." I didn't know," she stammered. "I just wanted to make sure it was entered properly." The manager shook his head and turned toward the teller. "Didn't you tell her? Why didn't you guide her properly?" The teller smirked. "I did, sir," but she insisted. That wasn't true, but Sarah didn't argue. She stood there silently, her eyes stinging. The manager sighed dramatically and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "We get all kinds of people here. Some don't even know basic banking rules. It wastes our time." A man in the queue laughed under his breath, and a few others joined. The teller pretended to stay busy, though her lips twitched in amusement. Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to disappear. Every word felt like a knife, not because of the insult, but because it was happening in front of strangers. People she didn't even know were laughing at her, judging her, as if her worth could be measured by the money in that envelope. She took a small step back and said in a shaky voice, "I'm sorry if I caused trouble. It won't happen again." But the manager wasn't done. "Sorry isn't the point," he snapped. "You people come here without understanding how banks work. Do you know how much time you waste? This isn't a charity center." The words "you people" hit her hard. They echoed in her head. You people. What did he mean by that? Poor, uneducated? Ordinary? A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "Sir," she said softly, "I've been a customer here for years. I only wanted to deposit my savings safely." The manager raised his eyebrows, clearly unimpressed. "Savings? How much do you think that small sum means to this bank? Next time, use the deposit machine or go to a smaller branch. We handle serious transactions here." There was laughter again. Someone muttered, "Maybe she's here to beg for interest." Another said, "Looks like she's in the wrong place." Sarah's eyes burned, but she forced herself not to cry. She stood straight, her dignity the only thing she could hold on to. Inside she was breaking, but she wouldn't let them see. At that moment, a young trainee from another counter who had been quietly watching the scene stepped forward. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "she hasn't done anything wrong." "Every customer deserves—" The manager shot him a glare so fierce that he stopped mid-sentence. "Get back to work," he barked. The trainee lowered his head and returned to his desk. Sarah managed a faint, grateful smile in his direction, but he couldn't meet her eyes. The humiliation seemed endless, Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her receipt. "May I go now?" she asked quietly. The manager didn't respond at first. He looked her over one more time, his eyes filled with silent judgment. Then he handed her the slip with a smirk. "Yes, you may. But next time don't hold up my staff for such insignificant amounts." Sarah took it carefully, nodded, and turned away. Her throat felt tight and tears blurred her vision. She walked toward the exit as fast as she could, her steps small and unsteady. The whispers followed her like shadows. As she reached the glass doors, a small boy outside waved at her, the son of one of the guards who often saw her in the neighborhood. His innocent smile made her pause. She smiled back weakly and wiped her tears before stepping out into the sunlight. Outside, the world seemed brighter but colder. The sound of traffic, the chatter of people, everything felt distant. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, her mind replaying every word, every laugh, every cruel glance. Why do people think money decides respect? She thought. Why can't kindness matter more than clothes or cash? She sat on a bench near the corner, staring at her hands. The receipt lay crumpled between her fingers. For a moment she thought about calling David, but then she stopped herself. He was busy, and she didn't want to worry him, but fate had other plans. Unbeknownst to Sarah, at that very moment, David's car had entered the same street. He had finished an early business meeting nearby and decided to surprise his wife by picking her up from the bank. As he parked his sleek black car in front of the building, his sharp eyes noticed something immediately. The uncomfortable way people were staring toward the door and the sight of his wife stepping out with red eyes and trembling hands. His jaw tightened. He had seen that expression before, the face of someone deeply hurt but too kind to speak up. He stepped out of the car, straightened his suit, and walked toward the entrance. What happened next would change not only Sarah's day, but the entire bank's reputation forever. The air inside the bank felt heavier than before. The quiet hum of machines and the faint murmurs of customers couldn't hide the uneasy tension that now filled the room. The manager, Mr. Roberts, stood with his chest puffed out, pretending to check documents, though he was clearly still pleased with how he had handled the small depositor. He adjusted his tie and gave the teller a proud smile, as if embarrassing someone had proven his authority. "Some people," he muttered to her, shaking his head, "just walk in here thinking they own the place. It's important to remind them where they stand." The teller nodded eagerly. "You did the right thing, sir. She looked like she didn't belong here." They both chuckled quietly. The customers nearby overheard but didn't say anything. They were too used to scenes like this. Power against modesty, arrogance against silence. Meanwhile, just outside, the tall glass doors swung open again. The sound of expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor made several heads turn. A man in a dark gray suit entered, carrying himself with effortless confidence. His presence commanded attention instantly. It was David. His expression was calm, but his eyes, sharp, deep, and unreadable, scanned the room. He spotted Sarah near the exit, standing still, holding her bag close. She looked so small and fragile under the bright fluorescent lights. The sight pierced his heart. He walked straight to her, his pace steady. "Sarah," he said softly. She turned, startled. Her eyes widened in surprise, then filled with tears again. "David?" she whispered. "What are you doing here?" "I finished early," he replied gently. "I thought I'd surprise you, but it looks like I came just in time." Sarah shook her head quickly, trying to smile. "No, it's nothing. Let's just go home." But David could see the pain behind her eyes. He noticed the way her hands trembled, the red around her eyelids, the slight crack in her voice. He knew his wife, calm, strong, and kind, and she never looked like this unless something truly hurt her. Before he could say anything more, the manager spotted them. He frowned, irritated. He didn't recognize David immediately. He only saw another man in an expensive suit and assumed he was another customer. "Excuse me, sir," the manager said, walking over briskly. "If you're not here for business, please step aside. We're quite busy." David turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting the manager's. "Oh, I believe you were quite busy already," he said calmly. "Busy humiliating my wife, weren't you?" The room went completely silent. The teller froze mid-sentence. The whispering stopped. Even the security guard at the door stood still. The manager blinked, confused. "Your wife?" he repeated uncertainly, his confidence slipping. David nodded once. Yes, my wife Sarah. The same woman you and your staff decided to insult for making an honest deposit. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the manager forced a nervous laugh. Oh, sir, I think you're mistaken. There must have been some misunderstanding. David's tone remained even, but his eyes were cold. I don't think there's any misunderstanding. I saw the way everyone looked at her. I heard what was said. The teller's face turned pale. The people in line began to whisper again. This time not about Sarah, but about who this man might be. Trying to regain control, the manager straightened his jacket. Sir, with all due respect, we treat every customer equally. David interrupted him sharply. Equally? By laughing at them? By questioning their worth because of the amount they deposit? He took a slow step closer, his voice quiet but cutting through the air. Tell me, Mr. Manager, do you decide respect based on how much money someone carries? The manager swallowed hard, sweat forming on his forehead. No, of course not, sir. We value every customer. David cut him off again, his tone still calm but firm. Good. Because the woman you disrespected happens to be the wife of the man who owns a major share in this bank. The manager froze. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock and fear. The teller gasped audibly. David turned to Sarah, his expression softening instantly. You shouldn't have had to go through this, he said gently. You've always been kind to everyone. It's time they learn that kindness isn't weakness. Then, facing the stunned staff again, he said clearly, call your regional head now. I'll be closing my accounts with this branch today. The room buzzed with whispers. One customer dropped his phone in surprise. The manager stammered, Sir, please, this isn't necessary. David raised a hand. It's absolutely necessary. If this is how your staff treats people, I want nothing to do with it. The teller looked near tears. The manager's arrogance melted into panic. He suddenly looked small, insignificant, the same way he had tried to make Sarah feel minutes ago. David placed a reassuring arm around Sarah's shoulders and said softly, Let's go, love. As they walked toward the door, everyone in the bank watched in silence. Some felt ashamed, others secretly admired the moment. A quiet woman's dignity restored in the most powerful way. The manager followed them halfway, mumbling apologies that sounded hollow and desperate. But David didn't turn back. When they stepped outside, the sun felt warmer than before. Sarah looked up at her husband with teary eyes. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. David smiled faintly. Yes, I did. Not because of the money, but because no one deserves to be treated like that. Not you, not anyone. Sarah took his hand and squeezed it gently. For the first time that day, her heart felt light again. Behind them, through the glass doors, the manager stood frozen, realizing that his arrogance had just cost the bank far more than he could ever imagine. The sunlight poured gently through the glass doors of the bank, but inside the air still buzzed with uneasy silence. Every employee pretended to work, though their eyes occasionally darted toward the door. The same door through which David and Sarah had just stepped out. The scene that had unfolded moments ago left everyone stunned, especially the manager. Outside, David opened the car door for Sarah, helping her in with quiet care. His touch was gentle, but his expression remained hard, cold with anger beneath the calm surface. Sarah sat silently, staring out the window, lost in thought. She wasn't used to such scenes. She avoided attention, preferred peace. Yet this time she couldn't stop replaying the humiliation over and over in her head. David stood by the car for a moment, his phone in hand, his jaw set. He made a single call. Yes, this is David Miller. I want a meeting with the regional director of First City Bank. Now. His voice was calm but carried authority that allowed no refusal. Within seconds, the message was delivered. But just as he was about to get into the car, the glass doors swung open again. The manager, Mr. Robert, came rushing out, sweat glistening on his forehead, his tie slightly crooked. His confident walk from earlier had turned into a nervous shuffle. Sir, please wait a moment, he called, his voice shaking slightly. David turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. Yes? Mr. Robert stopped a few feet away, struggling to catch his breath. Sir, I truly apologize for what happened. It was a misunderstanding. Please give us another chance. The bank values your presence. Sarah sat in the car, watching through the window. A part of her pitied him. Another part of her remembered how harshly he had spoken. how small he had made her feel just because she looked ordinary. David crossed his arms. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated. "You humiliated my wife in front of a room full of people. You mocked her deposit. You called her one of those people. Tell me, what part of that sounds like a misunderstanding to you?" The manager's face turned pale. "Sir, I didn't know who she was." David's voice cut through like ice. "That's exactly the problem. You respect people only when you know who they are." A few people on the sidewalk had stopped to watch. The guard near the door shifted nervously, pretending to adjust his cap. The teller peeked through the window, eyes wide, whispering to her colleague. Mr. Robert swallowed hard. "Sir, I've been with this bank for 15 years. This is my career. Please, I beg you, don't report this. I'll lose everything." David stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And what would you have taken from my wife if I hadn't shown up? Her pride? Her self-respect? Maybe her belief in kindness?" For a moment, no one spoke. Even the sound of traffic seemed to fade. Sarah looked at her husband. His calm fury, both terrifying and beautiful. She had seen him angry before, but this was different. This wasn't rage for himself. It was for her. Finally, David sighed and said, "You should have treated her with respect regardless of who she was. That's what a true professional does. You've built your authority on arrogance, not leadership." The manager's shoulders slumped. His voice cracked. "Please, sir, give me one chance to fix this. I'll do anything." David looked at him for a long moment, then turned to Sarah. "What do you think, love?" he asked softly. Sarah hesitated. She didn't like revenge. She only wanted peace. "David," she said gently, "let it go. What's done is done. I just want to go home." Her voice, calm and forgiving, carried more weight than any punishment could. David smiled faintly. She was always the kind-hearted one. But he wasn't done teaching a lesson. He turned back to the manager. "You should thank her, not me," he said. "She's the only reason I'm walking away quietly today. But I expect something from you." Mr. Robert nodded quickly. "Anything, sir. Anything you say." David's tone softened but remained firm. "Starting tomorrow, I want every single employee here trained in customer respect. And you will personally apologize to every person you've ever belittled." The manager's eyes widened. He hadn't expected that. "Yes, sir," he said quickly, almost in relief. David nodded once and opened the car door. "Good. Let's hope you remember this day as the one that changed you, not destroyed you." As the car drove away, the onlookers slowly began to murmur. Some clapped quietly. Others looked down, ashamed of how they had judged Sarah earlier. Inside the bank, the teller sat frozen, realizing that her laughter had just cost her more than her pride, maybe her job. Sarah leaned her head against the window, watching the buildings pass by. "You didn't have to do all that," she said softly. David reached over and held her hand. "Maybe not. But sometimes silence only teaches the wrong people that they can get away with anything." Sarah smiled faintly, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "You always fight for what's right," she whispered. He looked at her and smiled. "And you always remind me what's worth fighting for." As the car disappeared down the busy street, the sunlight fell gently over the bank once more. Inside, the staff stood in silence, humbled, shaken, and changed. What began as an ordinary day had turned into a lesson none of them would ever forget. And for Sarah, the modest woman who had been humiliated moments ago, that same day became a reminder that dignity doesn't need wealth to shine. It just needs truth. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large glass windows of the bank. Everything looked normal again, at least on the surface. Employees moved briskly between counters, machines hummed softly, and the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. But beneath that calm, something was very different. Everyone was nervous. Every whisper carried the same name, David Miller. Mr. Robert, the manager, hadn't slept all night. He kept replaying the events in his mind, the humiliation, the fear, the piercing words David had spoken to him. He had learned that David Miller wasn't just a random wealthy client. He was the David Miller, one of the biggest investors and a key shareholder in their entire banking network. The revelation had hit him like a thunderbolt. He had scolded, insulted, and mocked the wife of one of the bank's most powerful figures, in front of customers no less. The thought made his stomach twist. By 9 a.m., the regional director's car pulled up outside the branch. A tall man in a dark blue suit stepped out, followed by two assistants carrying files. Everyone straightened instantly. The director didn't waste time on greetings. He marched straight to the manager's office. "Robert," he said sharply, closing the door behind him. "Do you realize what you've done?" The manager stood up nervously. "Sir, I didn't know who she was." "That's exactly the point," the director interrupted. "You shouldn't need to know who she was to treat her with respect. Do you have any idea how much damage this could cause? Mr. Miller could withdraw every investment he has with us. That's millions, Robert. Millions." The manager's voice trembled. "Sir, I've already sent him an apology." "Not enough," the director snapped. "He's coming here today, personally." Robert's face turned pale. "Here?" "Yes," the director said firmly. "And you will face him. You'll apologize to him and his wife in front of everyone. Maybe then we can hope for mercy." The words echoed in Robert's head like thunder. His legs felt weak. By noon, the news had spread across the city branch network. David Miller is visiting the bank. Every employee wore their best smile and stood straighter than usual. The guards polished the glass doors. The tellers arranged their counters neatly. And the manager rehearsed his apology under his breath for the 100th time. Then, at exactly 12:30, the doors opened. David walked in calm as ever, dressed in a navy suit that looked simple yet powerful. Beside him walked Sarah, wearing the same modest grace that had once been ridiculed. There was no expensive jewelry, no designer handbag, no attempt to look rich. Yet somehow she stood taller than anyone in the room. The moment they entered, silence fell. Every head turned. Even the sound of typing stopped. David walked straight to the manager's desk. "Good afternoon," he said politely. Robert swallowed hard. "Good afternoon, sir." "Mrs. Miller." He bowed slightly. "I can't express how deeply sorry I am for yesterday. I behaved unprofessionally and disrespectfully. I failed to treat you with basic decency. I'm truly ashamed." Sarah looked at him quietly. Her gentle eyes held neither anger nor triumph, only calm understanding. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it takes humiliation to open a person's eyes." The words hit deeper than any punishment could. David placed his hand lightly on her shoulder, then turned to the director. "I'm not here for revenge," he said firmly. "I'm here for change." The director nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Miller. We've already scheduled employee training programs on customer ethics." David raised a hand. "Good, but don't make it a one-day formality. Make it a culture. Respect should not depend on money, looks, or status. Every person who walks through these doors should feel valued, whether they deposit $1 or $1 million. The room was completely silent. Every employee listened, ashamed yet inspired. Even the customers standing in line watched in awe. Sarah smiled faintly. "That's all we ever wanted," she said softly. The director cleared his throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, please know we're deeply grateful for your forgiveness. The board will issue a formal apology, and your experience will serve as a lesson for every branch under our name." David nodded, his tone firm but kind. "Good. Let this be a reminder that dignity has no price tag." As he and Sarah turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The young trainee, the same one who had tried to defend Sarah the previous day, stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly, but his words were steady. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "I just want to say thank you for staying kind even when others weren't." Sarah's eyes softened. She smiled warmly. "Thank you for speaking up when others didn't." The moment felt like a ripple of light spreading across the room. Even the customers began to clap quietly, not because of David's wealth, but because of the truth that had just been spoken. Outside, as David opened the car door for Sarah once again, she looked back at the bank, the same place where she had felt so small just a day ago. Now it stood as a reminder of something greater. "Funny," she said with a soft laugh. "Yesterday I walked out of here humiliated. Today we walked out with our heads high." David smiled. "That's what happens when truth walks in. Even arrogance has to bow." Sarah leaned back in her seat as the car drove away, the city's noise fading behind them. For the first time in days, she felt at peace. Not because they had won anything, but because they had reminded the world that respect belongs to everyone. And in the quiet hum of the car, David reached for her hand and said, "Sometimes The richest person in the room isn't the one with the money, it's the one who carries grace. The following day, the story of what happened at the bank spread faster than wildfire. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It became a topic of conversation across the city. People whispered in cafes, office corridors, and even on social media. Did you hear about the billionaire who stood up for his modest wife? But while others were talking, Sarah and David carried on quietly. To them, it wasn't about fame. It was about dignity. David sat in his office that morning staring out the tall glass windows of his company building. The skyline stretched endlessly before him, glittering under the sunlight. His employees passed by his office door in silence, sensing his deep thought. He wasn't thinking about business deals or profits that morning. He was thinking about Sarah, and about the moment her gentle eyes filled with tears at the bank. That memory haunted him. It wasn't the money that bothered him. It was the fact that someone had tried to crush her spirit simply because she looked ordinary. He took a deep breath, stood up, and called his secretary. "Get me the head of the First City Banks Board," he said calmly. "I'd like to arrange a meeting for tomorrow." Within minutes, the appointment was confirmed. But before hanging up, David added, "And make sure every regional manager is there too." The next day, the boardroom of First City Bank buzzed with tension. Executives in crisp suits sat stiffly around a long mahogany table. The air was thick with unease. They all knew who was coming. When the door finally opened, David walked in, composed as ever. His expression was serious, but his eyes were calm, like a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Sarah walked in beside him, her presence quiet yet commanding. She wore a simple pastel dress and carried herself with her usual grace. Every executive stood up immediately. The chairman of the bank, an older man with silver hair, greeted them nervously. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, thank you for meeting us. We deeply regret what happened at our branch." David nodded politely. "I appreciate your concern," he said, "but I'm not here for apologies." The men exchanged uneasy glances. David continued, his voice steady but full of weight. "I'm here because this isn't about one rude manager or one careless moment. It's about something much deeper. Something that affects every customer who walks into your bank." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Everyone leaned forward slightly, waiting. Then he said, "You see, wealth doesn't define a person. Character does. My wife walked into your branch yesterday as a customer, not as a billionaire's wife. Yet she was humiliated because she didn't look rich enough. How many others have faced that same humiliation without anyone to stand up for them?" No one answered. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. Sarah looked around the room, her gentle voice breaking the silence. "People come to banks with hope," she said softly. "They trust that their hard-earned money will be safe. They don't expect to be laughed at. Respect shouldn't be a privilege for the rich. It should be a right for everyone." The chairman lowered his head slightly. Guilt written across his face, David continued, "I built my fortune by learning from people who had nothing but kindness to offer. I didn't forget them when I became successful. But your employees seem to have forgotten something simple, that every person, rich or poor, deserves respect." He glanced at Sarah, then back at the room. "So here's what I propose. From this day forward, every branch under your bank's name must run monthly training sessions focused on empathy, humility, and ethics. I'll fund the program myself, but I want results and not paperwork." The room fell completely still. No one had expected that. They thought he would demand firings, compensation, or public apology. Instead, he offered a chance to rebuild, but now with purpose. The chairman exhaled slowly. "Mr. Miller," he said with deep respect, "your words have opened our eyes. We'll implement your proposal immediately. You have my word." David smiled faintly. "Good. Let this be the last time someone walks out of your bank feeling small." As the meeting ended, one of the younger executives approached Sarah hesitantly. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "you could have punished us. But instead, you chose kindness." "Why?" Sarah smiled softly. "Because arrogance doesn't need more anger, and it needs understanding. Sometimes the best way to change people is to show them the kindness they don't deserve." The young man lowered his gaze, humbled. As David and Sarah stepped out of the building, the sun broke through the clouds. The city seemed brighter, lighter, as if the universe itself approved of what had just happened. Walking toward their car, Sarah looked up at her husband and said quietly, Your words today, they'll change lives. David smiled, his eyes soft with affection. Maybe, he said, but it's your grace that changed mine. She laughed gently. I think we make a good team, don't we? He squeezed her hand. The best kind, of one that fights for what's right? Together. And as they drove away, neither of them knew that somewhere in that same bank, an employee who had once mocked Sarah now sat alone, thinking deeply, maybe for the first time, about what respect truly means. Days passed after the powerful meeting, but the echoes of David and Sarah's words lingered across every branch of First City Bank. The story wasn't just an incident anymore. It had become a lesson. Managers whispered about it in meetings, tellers discussed it during lunch breaks, and even customers who had heard rumors about the event looked at bank staff differently, expecting more kindness, more humanity. At the main branch where it all began, the atmosphere had changed completely. The arrogance that once floated in the air had turned into quiet reflection. Every employee now greeted customers with genuine warmth. The laughter that used to follow behind people's backs had turned into politeness, even respect. But for the manager, Mr. Robert, the change wasn't easy. His pride had been shattered, his confidence replaced by guilt. Every time he looked at the counter where Sarah had stood, he felt a deep sting in his chest. A painful reminder of the woman he had humiliated for no reason. One morning, he arrived at the branch early. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting thin golden lines across his desk. He sat down slowly and took a deep breath. There was a letter on his table, his official warning from the regional office. But beside it was another envelope, smaller and handwritten. It was from David Miller. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a short note written in calm, steady handwriting. Mistakes don't define a man. What he does after realizing them does. David Miller. Robert read it over and over. There was no anger, no judgment, only wisdom. Tears welled up in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt humbled in the truest sense. That day, he called a meeting with all his staff. The employees gathered nervously, expecting another lecture. But this time his voice was different. Softer, slower, honest. I want to say something, he began. I've been a banker for over 15 years, and I thought I understood what respect meant. But I was wrong. A few days ago, I forgot that every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with kindness, no matter how they look, no matter how much money they have. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, and it opened my eyes. The room stayed silent. Some employees looked at the floor. Others blinked, unsure how to react. He continued, That woman, Mrs. Miller, taught me more in one moment of silence than any training could in a lifetime. From today onward, we'll run this branch differently. No more judgment. No more pride. We'll treat every customer as if they were our own family. For a moment, no one moved. Then the young trainee, the same boy who had tried to defend Sarah that day, raised his hand and said, Sir, if that's how we're going to work, I'll stand with you. The manager smiled faintly, his eyes glassy with emotion. Good, he said quietly. Let's start with that. Later that afternoon, the bank received an unexpected visit. David and Sarah walked in again, but this time there was no tension, only surprise and quiet excitement. Sarah smiled warmly as she saw the same teller who had mocked her. The young woman immediately stood up, her face pale with guilt. Mrs. Miller, she said shakily, I'm so sorry for what I did. I don't know what came over me that day. Sarah nodded gently. I forgave you long ago, she said softly. What matters is that you've learned. The teller's eyes filled with tears. You're too kind, she whispered. Then the manager came forward. His once proud posture was gone. He looked humbled, almost fragile, but there was honesty in his eyes now. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've been waiting to apologize in person. I was blind with pride, and I disrespected the very values I was supposed to uphold. I am deeply, truly sorry. David looked at him quietly for a moment, then nodded. Apology accepted, he said. Not because you have to, but because you mean it. Everyone deserves a second chance, and as long as they're willing to change. The manager lowered his head. I'll never forget this lesson, he said. David smiled faintly. Good. Then maybe something good came out of a bad day. Around them, the employees and customers who had gathered began to applaud softly, not because a billionaire was in the room, but because of what that moment represented. It wasn't about money or power. It was about humanity being restored. Sarah turned to the young trainee and said kindly, "I remember you. You spoke up when no one else did." The boy blushed slightly. "I just did what was right," he said shyly. "And that," Sarah replied with a smile, "is what makes all the difference." Before leaving, David placed a check on the counter, a generous donation for the bank's new Respect and Service training program. "This isn't charity," he said. "It's an investment in better people." The staff stood there speechless as the couple walked out once again hand in hand. Outside, the day was bright and peaceful. Sarah looked up at the blue sky and said softly, "It's strange how everything can change so quickly. One moment you're broken, the next you're healing." David looked at her with admiration. "That's life," he said gently. "It tests you, then teaches you. But only if you listen," she smiled. "And sometimes," she said, "it sends the right people to remind the world what kindness really means." He squeezed her hand. "Exactly." As their car disappeared into the golden afternoon light, the people inside the bank stood silently, their hearts changed forever. Respect wasn't just a word anymore. It had become a promise. Weeks passed since the unforgettable incident at the bank, but its echo continued to travel far beyond the walls of that building. It became more than a story. It became a lesson, one that would change the way many people thought, acted, and treated others. At first, it spread quietly, through whispered conversations among employees, through customers sharing their experiences, and through people who had witnessed the event firsthand. But soon, newspapers picked it up, then blogs, then social media. The headline read, "Billionaire teaches bank. Staff a priceless lesson in humanity." Yet, what people remembered most wasn't the wealth or the status. It was Sarah, the modest woman who faced humiliation, but chose forgiveness over anger, grace over revenge. Her calm courage touched hearts more deeply than any speech could. Inside the same bank that once carried pride and arrogance, things were very different now. Posters on the walls read, "Every customer matters. Respect is the currency that never loses value." The atmosphere had changed completely. Staff greeted even the humblest of visitors with warmth and patience. The manager, once proud and cold, now led by example, opening doors for elderly customers, listening carefully to every complaint and making sure no one left the bank feeling small. He often remembered Sarah's words. "Sometimes, it takes humiliation to open a person's eyes." He never wanted to close his eyes again. One bright afternoon, Sarah and David decided to stop by the same branch again, not for business, but simply to see how things were going. When they entered, the staff greeted them with genuine smiles. There was no fear this time, no fake politeness, just sincerity. "Welcome back, Mrs. Miller," the young trainee said happily. "You'll be glad to know we've started weekly empathy sessions. Everyone's been participating, even Mr. Robert." Sarah smiled warmly. "That's wonderful," she said. "I'm proud of all of you." Mr. Robert approached, carrying a file. "Mrs. Miller," he said respectfully, "we've also created a scholarship fund for underprivileged students inspired by you and Mr. Miller. We call it the GRACE program. It helps young people learn about financial literacy and kindness and leadership." Sarah's eyes glistened. "That's beautiful," she said softly. "You've truly turned something painful into something powerful." The manager nodded humbly. "You taught us that, ma'am." Outside, as David and Sarah walked along the sunny pavement, people passing by recognized them and smiled, not with awe for their wealth, but with admiration for their humility. "David Miller," someone whispered, "the man who stood up for respect." "And his wife," another added, "the woman who changed hearts without raising her voice." But Sarah didn't see herself as a hero. To her, she was just an ordinary woman who had faced an unfair moment and chose the high road. She believed that sometimes the quietest people make the loudest impact. That evening back home, she sat on the balcony with David. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and gold. She sipped her tea slowly, her heart full. "Do you think they really changed?" she asked softly. David looked out at the horizon. "Yes," he said. "And not just them. Everyone who heard your story learned something important. That's how change starts, one act of courage at a time." Sarah smiled gently. "I never wanted to be part of something so big," she said. David reached for her hand. "You didn't try to be. he said. That's why it worked. You just stayed true to who you are. A small breeze lifted her hair as she looked at him with affection. Maybe we can't fix the whole world, she said thoughtfully. But if we can make one corner of it a little kinder, isn't that enough? David smiled. That's more than enough. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink below the city skyline. The golden light reflected off the windows of the distant bank, the same place where their story had begun. A few weeks later, a letter arrived for Sarah. It was handwritten with neat and careful strokes. It was from the same young trainee at the bank,